Instead of asking the question, why don't they just get a job? We should actually be asking, why doesn't our government better support individuals who are experiencing homelessness? Or why is minimum wage not a livable wage?
Welcome to Beyond the Threshold, a podcast where we discuss the various ways housing, mental health, and substance use disorders collide. This pod is brought to you by Threshold's Homes and Supports out of Kitchener, Ontario. I'm your host, Ian, and with me today is my co-hosts, Ali and Farron. Today is part 1 of our episodes on stigma, language, and the need for change. Ali and Farron, why don't you go ahead, introduce yourselves, and take it away.
My name is Ali, and I'm a social worker with the Assertive Community Treatment Team, and I have our student here, Farron.
Hi, Ali.
Hey. And we're going to chat about the reality of stigma today and its effects on individuals' lives and our system as a whole. We'll debunk some common myths around substance use, mental health, and homelessness, and more, as well as provide a general overview of stigma and its negative consequences. Knowing more about these will help with decreasing the stigma that we may not even know we're contributing to, because when we know better, we do better. By taking steps towards creating a stigma-free world, we can better support individuals rather than isolating and wrongfully shaming them. It's also important to highlight the language we're using in an attempt to decrease stigma related to substance use, mental health, and those experiencing homelessness. Some words that are commonly used, such as addict, crazy, and overdose, can be switched to person-first terms, such as person who uses substances, or person with a mental health disorder, and accidental or intentional drug poisoning, for example. We'll also be saying experiencing homelessness as opposed to calling, quote-unquote, homeless person. We will dive into this a little deeper later on regarding why, as well as look into more stigmatizing language we should work on eliminating from our vocab. But in the meantime, it is just key that we recognize how severely stigma can affect an individual's life and the reality of how its presence in our society today creates a significant barrier to the health and wellness of our communities. The Government of Canada defines stigma as negative attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors about or towards a group of people because of their situation in life. It includes discrimination, prejudice, judgment, and stereotypes. Most often, stigma emerges in the form of derogatory language that shames and belittles people. Such language can lead to a cycle of behaviors and attitudes that isolate and marginalize people who live with mental health challenges, use substances, or experience homelessness. By shifting our language and developing a better awareness around the reality of substance use, mental health, and those experiencing homelessness, we can begin to take steps in the right direction towards creating a more welcoming and collaborative space that individuals feel safe and supported within.
That's exactly it, Ali. It's super important to make sure we are aware of our own conditioned biases and how we normalize language in our daily lives. Half the time, we don't even realize how harmful some of the things we are saying can be to others. When it comes to stigma, it often stems from a fear that emerges due to how substance use, mental health, and those experiencing homelessness are typically depicted in the media. This continues to develop when other people who experience this fear relay their beliefs about people who use substances, are experiencing homelessness, or struggle with mental illness to other people in their lives, creating an ongoing cycle of stigma. Many individuals label those who live with mental health challenges, use substances, or experience homelessness as being a moral failure, without understanding that the reality is no one wakes up and hopes to deal with symptoms, become addicted, or lose their shelter that day. For individuals experiencing homelessness, there's a need to recognize that the stigma stems from a long history of isolation and discrimination of the less fortunate and vulnerable. It has become ingrained in our society to view those living on the streets as quote-unquote less than us, dangerous, lazy, or dirty. The reality is that these are all just negative stereotypes that have developed over the course of many years due to fear, lack of understanding, and inconceived societal notions. Likewise, mental health stigma also emerges from society's preconceived thoughts and notions about mental illness. In the past, mental illness was never recognized as a real illness. Instead, individuals struggling with their mental health were labeled as, quotes, crazy or too different, and as a result were isolated, segregated, and looked down upon by society. This lack of understanding of the reality of mental health led to an intense amount of stigma being developed around mental illness, causing it to become a very taboo topic. This led to many unethical institutions being created as a means to house individuals living with mental health, physical health, and developmental challenges that society didn't know how to navigate. We now know that mental illness is in fact a real legitimate illness, just like any other physical ailment that requires support and treatment to get better. Just because we cannot visibly see someone's struggles does not mean they are not real. Not only that, but isolating individuals and taking them away from their support system, social supports, and community only further contributes to negative symptoms they may be experiencing. Today, we are slowly seeing the unraveling of the stigma as individuals like you and I speak out about the reality of mental illness and its presence in our society today. Similar to mental health, research on substance use has allowed us to take leaps towards developing a better and more compassionate understanding of this issue. In the past, substance use was viewed as a poor choice that negatively reflected an individual's character. Today, we now know that substance use disorders are a chronic, treatable medical disorder from which individuals can recover and continue on to lead quality lives. That being said, it's also important to acknowledge that they may also be leading quality lives with their substance use disorder as well, just like with mental illness and those experiencing homelessness. It's not always black and white, and it's important to recognize that there are many other factors such as mental and physical health, the housing crisis, pain management, the system itself, and more that play into reasons why individuals use substances. At the end of the day, they wouldn't be doing it if they didn't find a benefit within using. Therefore, we need to take the time to look more at the reason behind their use as opposed to the use itself. When we understand more about the complexity of humans, we can ultimately come from a compassionate place, rather than looking at those in our community who struggle with mental illness, experience homelessness, or use substances as lesser than us.
Totally. The reality is, if you have been addicted to something, especially a substance use, and that includes alcohol, it's an extremely difficult experience to communicate to someone effectively who has not experienced it. Since substance use is a complex condition in which there is uncontrolled use of substance despite many harmful consequences, it really is hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived with a substance use disorder. Substance use is a medical disorder linked to specific changes in the brain structure and function that occurs over time. And just like we cannot ever fully understand what like having cancer would be like unless we've experienced it, substance use is the same. That being said, one of the best ways I have ever heard a client describe an opiate addiction came from an 18-year-old that was living with a prescription opioid addiction. It was along the lines of this. Imagine yourself in the middle of a desert first thing in the morning. You're walking. At first, it's not too bad. You don't feel the greatest, but it is manageable. Then as the day wears on, you start to feel worse. You start to shake, sweat, and then it just keeps getting worse. Now you have a headache. You desperately need water. You start to worry and feel anxious. You're dying of thirst. This gets worse. The sun is beating down. You're sweating profusely, and you feel sick to your stomach. Your head's pounding, the shakes are getting worse, and your whole body feels like you're on fire and freezing cold all at once. You're beyond desperate now. The anxiety is unbearable, you can't think straight, and you would lie, cheat, and steal for a drink of water, even just a drop. Finally, you reach an oasis of water and plunging in, the sickness, the shaking, the sweating, the anxiety, they are all gone. Not only that, but the water is the best thing you've ever tasted in your life. Then you go to bed, wake up the next morning, and find yourself back in that desert, wondering, how did I get here? That's basically it. The only thing I would add is for a lot of people heavily in opioid addiction for a prolonged period of time, they start out in the middle of the day feeling awful from the moment they wake up.
I really like that analogy because it puts into perspective for those who don't use substances to understand just how vital it is to get that need met. We all have needs. Some are the same and some are very different. We shouldn't judge someone for getting their needs met when we try to do the same for ourselves every day. It's also important to note that stigma does not just exist socially. Stigma is internalized, creating shame, low self-esteem, and a fear of accessing support. In turn, this can lead to further mental health concerns, as well as riskier substance use due to using alone in order to hide it. Lastly, structural stigma also plays a role in the social and internalized stigma we see regularly. Restrictive policies in health and social services, such as not providing medications or support until substance use is more managed, or community services not getting enough funding to the point that individuals cannot get the support they need due to lack of resources or having to spend years on a wait list. This response is ultimately not sustainable. We live in a world that is constantly consumed by media, whether it's the news, social media, posters, signs, advertisements, and more. We're so used to this constant flood of information that our brains rarely stop to critically question whether or not the information we're consuming is based on fact. Ultimately, it would be really hard for our brains to filter every single thought that passes through our minds, because on average, humans have 60,000 thoughts per day. Having to fact check every single one would be an overwhelming challenge. However, it is important to bring a critical lens to the information we are looking at. The reason being is that so much of the media we see influences the perspectives we have on it. For example, there was recently a headline stating, quotes, "Inside the life of Hollywood's newest bad boy, hunk Jeremy Allen White is a chain-smoking, troubled former addict who's been through a messy divorce and must be breathalyzed every time he sees his children." That is not only a real headline straight from the Daily Mail, but it is also twisting what is a brave journey to recovery in order to stay present in his children's lives to be some sort of moral failing. That implies we, the audience, in taking this information, should quote-unquote never do something like this, further separating us from those who are living with this challenging disorder. Many other similar headlines from the Daily Mail and other news outlets also treat those who use substances or live with mental health challenges as a, quotes, other, without most people even questioning it. Here are some more examples. Lindsay Lohan, an ex-child star out of control. Or Britney, I dabbled with drugs. Little by little, the edifice of Britney Spears' whole image has been chipped away. We know nothing about the situation any of these individuals are in, yet we consume the media like we know them personally enough to make judgments on them. I myself am guilty of this. As we mentioned earlier, it is very hard to filter out every single thought. That being said, it's important to consider these specific situations through a critical lens that takes into consideration a holistic view of the media that considers the social and political trends we're already seeing. Media like this podcast is an example of how we're challenging the status quo of the current narrative that is out there, and in challenging status quos, we're also likely to get backlash because we are going against the grain that is typically seen in our media. It's uncomfortable to sit with our thoughts sometimes and ask ourselves if we've been wrongly judging someone for something, or if we're the ones who may have been perceiving things wrong. Humans in general have a tough time admitting we're wrong sometimes. It's easier to continue going with the current conditioned thought patterns that have been instilled in us for decades, because unlearning and relearning things will always be much harder. It's up to us if we want to do the work to make sure the perspectives we have are based in fact and or opinions that do not dehumanize anyone else.
I totally agree. Our system is broken and continues to negatively impact those who are already the most vulnerable. One aspect that contributes to the stigma and reinforces negative perceptions are the many myths out there that people don't realize aren't true. One extremely common myth is that people are dangerous when using substances. This is not necessarily true, and it's actually very circumstantial in reality. Much like any person, the potential for harm is a possibility, whether substances are involved or not. I would argue the potential for dangerous behaviors directed at community members or staff is more likely to come from a person who uses substances when they are not high, but rather come as a result of their own maladaptive coping and social strategies for getting their needs met. For example, some individuals have learned to use violence as a means to make people do what they want or to meet a need. It ultimately became a strategy they default to, and yet is not directly connected to their substance use. Yes, the need for substances may be driving this behavior, but the penchant for violence as a coping strategy was learned likely well before they started using. Correlation doesn't always equal causation. That being said, for the average person using substances, they are more likely to be a harm to themselves than others when they are high, as they may choose to participate in risky activities. Furthermore, people in the cycle of addiction tend to find themselves in situations where violence is much more likely to happen to them, like sex trafficking or participating in illegal activities that are inherently dangerous, like drug dealing or using alone in places where help may not even be present if they experience a drug poisoning. There are exceptions, like most individuals tend to be pretty irritable when they are withdrawing and are more likely to be verbally aggressive, just like anyone else who's feeling very sick and unable to meet their own needs. At the end of the day, it's not the person that's dangerous, but the circumstances often out of their control that they find themselves in, and the way that they have learned to react to these situations throughout their personal life experiences. Just like the rest of us who've likely also used maladaptive coping strategies at one point in our lives.
I think there's a lot we can take away from that. It is so critical that we recognize just how easy it is for us to put a label on an entire group of people, rather than taking the time to step back and realize that each person is a unique individual with unique circumstances. It is incredibly unfair of us to view someone as XYZ because we have been led to believe that since other people, quote unquote, like them, have acted this way before, implying they all must be the same. This is quite often how negative stigma is born. We hear or are taught by some external source that a certain category of people, such as people who use substances or live with mental health challenges, are this one particular way. We then adopt this into our own personal narrative of them, and going forward, every single person in that category is now given this negative label. This is an example of the concept of othering, which can be defined as, quote unquote, viewing or treating a person or group of people as intrinsically different and alien to oneself. In doing this, we are able to separate ourselves, further pushing us to see those who are unlike ourselves as lesser than. Stigma essentially erases the individuality of a person and takes away their ability to stand as their own person. Just because someone uses substances, lives with mental health challenges, or experiences homelessness does not and will never mean that they are exactly the same as every other person who also does the same behaviors. It would be like assuming that every person who watches movies enjoys eating popcorn as a snack. Just because some people like popcorn with their movies doesn't mean that all of them do. We know that there are many other snacks out there that people also enjoy. It would ultimately be unfair to assume everybody acts the same, just because of a typical stereotype such as having popcorn with a movie. Like Ali said earlier, correlation does not equal causation. It's generalizing an entire group of people down to one characteristic that doesn't at all define who they are as a person. Instead, we should be actually taking the time to listen to their story and hear their experiences, as this can really help us to see them and understand where they are coming from.
Wow. I think when you put it into that perspective, it really becomes simple. Deep down, we all know that everyone is their own person, and yet we tend to be so quick to categorize and label one another based on what we've previously seen or been told. All it takes is for us to pause and reflect to realize that every single person is unique and that the things we believe may be true are not always true. This leads to another common myth that we hear a lot related to substance use. Many people believe that anyone touching fentanyl by accident who doesn't typically use it will experience a drug poisoning. This isn't true whatsoever and has been misrepresented by police and media outlets who may be experiencing shock from being in a crisis situation and misreported as symptoms of a drug poisoning. In reality, there is no drug or medication in existence that could be absorbed through the skin so rapidly that it would cause a drug poisoning. Fentanyl must be introduced into the bloodstream or a mucous membrane in order for someone to feel its effects. In fact, one study conducted by the American Colleges of Medical Toxicology and the American Academy of Clinical Toxicology found that someone would need to stand in a room for over 2 hours inhaling the highest airborne concentration of fentanyl to yield a therapeutic dose of the substance, to say nothing of a potentially lethal one. To make it even more clear, you could have a high concentration fentanyl patch held between your hands and would need more than 15 minutes of direct exposure to begin feeling an effect. While I wouldn't recommend doing this, myths like this have been known to stop people from helping others experiencing a drug poisoning due to fear when there is actually nothing to be afraid of. I also do want to just clarify that there is a difference between opioids and opiates, despite them often being used interchangeably. Opioids refer to a class of synthetic chemicals created in a lab like a Percocet or a fentanyl patch, versus opiates with a T, which are naturally derived from plant matter, similar something like heroin. So on a chemical level, they are very different, but to your brain, it can't tell the difference because both substances affect the same receptors. So opiate substitution therapies can be used for opiates as well as opioids, given both have the same addictive properties and our brains respond the same to them.
That's a great point, Ali. Thanks for clarifying that. Another myth is the idea that addiction is a choice. While we understand that there is a choice involved when it comes to choosing to use a substance, we do need to keep in mind that there can be many factors here as well, such as peer pressure, masking mental health symptoms, using it as a coping strategy, and so on. But being addicted in and of itself is not a choice. No one chooses how their brain will react to substances, and it is not a 100% certainty to be addicted to a substance just because you've tried it. We see this a lot when individuals are prescribed opioids after recovering from a surgery. Despite many people being prescribed similar pills like Percocets or hydromorphones, they don't always have the same outcome when it comes to the long-term dependency on these prescriptions. In fact, only 10% of people who have surgery and are prescribed pain medications are addicted to them within the following year of the surgery.
Wow, that is an interesting statistic given how common surgeries are. It's also commonly thought that withdrawal symptoms only last a few days and people should be able to push through them. Not only can withdrawal symptoms last weeks depending on the substance, but post-acute withdrawal syndrome symptoms, also known as PAWS, P-A-W-S, can last for several years following the last use of substances. Because the brain has been synthetically getting its dopamine and endorphins while using the substances, the brain hasn't needed to produce much of it on its own for likely quite some time. I heard a cool analogy about this recently. So if you cloned yourself and sent that version of you to work and they were doing a good job, would you also go to work? Of course not. And that's what the brain is thinking too. Why would I put effort into producing endorphins and dopamine when I'm getting it so easily somewhere else? Because of this, it takes the brain years to be able to recover and return to its normal natural dopamine and endorphin amounts. This can make it incredibly difficult for people in recovery to remain off a substance, as the withdrawals can continue for such a substantial amount of time. Irritability, mood changes, insomnia, problems concentrating and thinking, decreased sex drive, unexplained physical pain, and more are common pause symptoms.
Wow, no wonder recovery is such a challenging journey when people could be dealing with so many negative symptoms for years. I'm glad to be addressing this next myth, as this misconception is so widespread and misinformed. It is a very common thought that individuals who are experiencing homelessness should, quote unquote, just get a job. If we break it down to the basics, in order to get a job, someone typically needs a bank account for the hiring employer to deposit the money in. So let's just say that someone experiencing homelessness goes to the bank to get a bank account. Well, now they're being asked to provide proof of the last 2 years of residence, with documentation. So not only is this person not able to get a bank account, but it's unlikely they can get housing if they cannot provide a proof of income or first and last month's rent without a job. The only loopholes to this situation are the community services, such as affordable housing programs, subsidies, or not requiring proof of income, most of which are really hard to come by, especially in today's competitive housing market, with housing wait lists taking over half a decade to get through. Individuals can't get a job because they have no fixed address, but they also can't get a fixed address because they don't have a job. It's ultimately a catch-22. And we haven't even added in the layer of complexities that exacerbate this concern, such as mental health conditions, individuals' capacity to hold and maintain a job, ability to afford clothing or materials for a job, ability to orient self to time and place enough to know when a shift starts, as well as the minimum wage nowadays that makes it impossible to afford something that is market rent to even begin with. Our system has created an issue in which people are forced to stay in the positions they are currently in solely because of the inflexibility of the system and the lack of funding for supports that could better meet their needs. It also implies that the only way we are worthy in this society is if we are considered productive members of society, when in reality, we are worthy solely because we exist. Our system's solution to homelessness is simply getting people off the streets, also known as building more shelters. What we also know to be true is even if we build enough shelters for the individuals in our communities to have a roof over their head, we know that the number of individuals experiencing homelessness will continue to grow, and without fail, we will just need more shelters in the future. Rather than constantly building shelters, we need to be proactive by funding and creating policies that work towards long-term housing solutions, rather than just normalizing people losing their housing. Ontario Canada Project has a really great analogy for this. Shelters, warming stations, community centres, and food kitchens are still an integral part of ending homelessness. In the same way, our paramedics are an essential part of our healthcare system. That being said, we would never rely only on paramedics for our entire healthcare system, because we know that no one should have to wait until an emergency to access care. Being proactive means we can support people before they have a crisis, before they're on the streets to even begin with. Housing should be considered a critical component of our health, because it literally is one of the most major and impactful pieces to our well-being. The average life expectancy in Canada is 82, and the average life expectancy for those experiencing homelessness is 42. Not being housed typically means someone is in some form of survival mode, and some semblance of instability is present in their lives. This is not to say that this is the experience for every person experiencing homelessness, as there are individuals who chose this for themselves and are living with what they deem to be a decent quality of life. Public health exists as a means to help us thrive, not as a system that is just here to keep us alive. The public sector's literal job is to care for the public, but as we see on the front lines, it feels like more of a challenge in Canada every day. Instead of asking the question, why don't they just get a job, we should actually be asking, why doesn't our government better support individuals who are experiencing homelessness? Or why is minimum wage not a livable wage? Or why are there so many barriers that prevent those experiencing homelessness from being able to get a job or a house? Canada is a well-off country, and it should not be the norm that so many people are not able to access safe, affordable, and secure housing. Next time the conditioned thought of, quote-unquote, maybe they should just get a job pops into your head, remember this long list of reasons that explains it's a systemic issue as opposed to a moral failing. We know this to be true because it's not just one person experiencing homelessness. It's an entire community of individuals and several hundreds of thousands of individuals across Canada. When an obvious pattern emerges like this, we know it's not an anomaly, but rather a pattern of systemic failure. In a quote from the Ontario Canada Project, they state, "Canada does not give all of us an equitable chance to be warm at night or to have our overall basic needs met, and that is a failure of our government and private sector, not the person experiencing it."
That's an impressive quote, Farron. I totally agree. Housing is a human right, and profit should never be more important than people.
Thanks, Allie and Farron, for providing me and our listeners some much-needed info and dispelling some of the myths that hamper the great progress I know we can make when we're all on the same page. If you enjoyed Part 1 as much as I did, please tune in to Part 2, where Allie and Farron will be back to talk more on stigma and how it impacts everyone, not just those diagnosed with mental health or living rough in the community. If you enjoyed this episode of Beyond the Threshold, please like and subscribe and leave a rating and review. For more Beyond the Threshold and information from our sponsor, Threshold Homes and Supports, you can find us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. You can also check us out at thresholdsupports.ca, or you can follow us on Instagram at Threshold Supports, on X at Welcome to THS, as well as Facebook. Thanks for listening.